The Dawes Act itself is not considered a success, either by Native Americans or the government.
In fact, it turned out to be more or less a disaster because of poor administration, because of corruption. In many cases, these Indian peoples were given the worst of the land. Many refused to cooperate, signing up on the rolls. They wanted to hold on this land, of course, communally. They wanted to keep it in the way that they always had. They considered this a collective possession of them as a people, not to be divvied up, not to be divided up and given to individuals. And so they simply refused to cooperate. That meant that if they were not on the rolls, they didn't get any land. The land was still divided and given away. They were now just out of it, at a loss.
The arrival of the miners, the empire building of the cattle ranchers, the dispersal of the Indian tribes, all serve as a prelude to a massive movement of farmers into the Plains region.
More land was brought under cultivation in the United States between 1870 and 1900 than in all of American and colonial history prior to that. The most dramatic growth came on the eastern Great Plains, where this agricultural economy that was so well developed in the American Midwest spread across the Mississippi River, across the Missouri River, into Kansas and Nebraska, into South Dakota, into Iowa, into those regions. The beginning of cultivation of grains. But farming was also booming elsewhere throughout the West during these years. It was booming in the interior West, in areas that were developed to feed these new centers of population, the mining towns. It was developing in Utah, around Salt Lake. It was booming in California. It was developing in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. So agriculture was developing in many different parts of the West. It developed very rapidly with the aid of the new technology of agriculture, and of course the aid of the railroad.
Just a few years earlier, such rapid agricultural growth would have seemed unlikely.
Lots of the soldiers who fought in the Indian Wars of the 1870s and 80s wrote home and they asked, "We don't know why we're fighting this war. This land is not going to be land that anyone is going to want." Americans were used to evaluating the quality of land based on the quality of trees that grew upon it, which is not an accurate way of understanding the fertility of soils. But the Great Plains had no trees on it. And so it was called by an early expedition the Great American Desert, and that term remained on maps of the United States well into the 19th century.
The interior far west has an environment that is one of the most unpredictable and erratic in the Western Hemisphere. For example, in an area of the plains that has an average annual rainfall of 15 inches, that might mean 20 or 22 inches one year, and it might mean 7 inches the next. A very risky business. During the early years of this great agricultural boom on the plains went through one of its periodic wet cycles. So, by good luck, it rained a good bit more than usual.
People began to farmstead on this land. They were given generous grants of land on either side of the railroad tracks. In fact, 10 miles in a checkerboard pattern on either side of their right-of-way was granted to them by Congress. And in order to sell it to farmers, they participated in one of the great deceptions of American land history, which was that essentially rain would follow the plow. It may look droughty to you, settler, but in fact, once you put in your crops, the climate itself will change. That's an out-and-out lie.
And so consequently, they began to overcommit themselves to farming in this region. And then in the 1890s, the hammer came down. The rainfall stopped. The drought came. And when that happened, the result was economic and human disaster.
Farm life on the Great Plains is different than farming in the Midwest or points east.
They built sod houses, literally these mud huts, in which they cut bricks out of the sod. Or you could also burn it for fuel.
They had to develop, for example, new types of plows, steel-tipped plows of a certain shape that would cut through the sod more easily. Barbed wire that was developed in the 1870s in Illinois, a cheap and practical device to keep animals, grazing animals like cattle and horses, out of certain areas, especially away from crops and away from certain water sources. So, millions and millions of pounds of barbed wire began to be produced almost overnight.